We're glad you decided to check out this message by Seabreeze Church and hope that you benefit from it. We also hope that you would join us either online or in person on a Sunday. We have a 9 o'clock live stream service online, and then we have in-person services on our campus at 9 and 10:30. So again, we hope that you would join us, and we hope that you enjoy this message.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you today. I think one of my favorite experiences personally when it comes to reading the Bible is the fact that it just continues to surprise me. And one of the things I've learned is that hidden under every surprise that I encounter in the Bible is a gold mine of blessing. If I'll just take the time to stop and scratch my head a little bit long enough to try to figure out what this means and then how I might apply this to my life. And this series comes out of one of my favorite surprising verses in the Bible and the gold mine that it represents. So we're going to start out with the first 5 words of this verse of surprise. And it starts out like this: make it your ambition to. And I'm just going to leave this blank to let the surprise linger. Now, if you know this verse, don't ruin the surprise for everyone. Don't shout it out. But just think, what would you think might go in this blank? Make it your ambition to. Or maybe just think, what are the things that you hear people say in this category? Maybe make it your ambition to pursue your dreams. That's a very popular one. Make it your ambition to make a name for yourself. Here's a big one. Make it your ambition to be happy. I mean, I hear that a lot. Make it your ambition to change the world. That's a good one. Make it your ambition to become financially secure. Definitely something that's important. Well, are you ready for the surprise? Here's what God says. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. Isn't that surprising? Does that sound very ambitious to you, first of all? That didn't sound ambitious to me at all. I mean, how hard is it to be quiet? I know for some people it is hard to be quiet. But this isn't talking about the number of words a person speaks or how loudly they do or don't speak those words. It's talking about an approach to life. Really, I would summarize it this way. I think what God is saying is, I want you to focus on being a doer more than a talker. I want you to focus on what you do more than what you say in life. The quietness that this is talking about is because you're busy working on doing real work. You don't have time just to sit around and talk. You're doing stuff. Now, you may be wired to be more or less talkative, but the impact of your life will flow mostly out of what you do, more so than out of what you say. Now, in our modern world, it's the talkers that get the screen time. It's the talkers that get most of the status. But that's not the way God designed the world to be. It's the doers that really make an impact in this world. So let me read the entire 2-verse surprise. 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 through 12. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. So it starts with the ambition to lead a quiet life, and then it continues with, just to make sure we're clear on what we mean by quiet life, God says, let me give you some characteristics of the kind of life that you need to ambitiously pursue over the course of your life. First, you need to mind your own business. Basically, do your work. Don't worry about what everyone else is doing. Don't worry about whether someone is or isn't doing their job unless that's part of your responsibility. For the most part, just keep your head down, do your work. Let other people worry about their work. You mind your own business. And then work with your hands. So are we only supposed to work in the trades? No. If you're working, your hands are probably involved. I mean, I'm on a keyboard most of my days. It's not heavy lifting, but it's work. The point this is making is that the income that you need to live on needs to come from your own hands, from your own work, not the work of someone else. Working with your hands is set in contrast to being dependent on somebody in this verse. I mean, why does it matter whether what you earn to live on comes from your own hands, your own work, or whether someone gives you what you need to live on? What's the difference? Well, being dependent, God says here, comes with a very, very steep cost. And the cost is the respect of others, of outsiders. Now, the point of this respect is not what people think of you, but the fact that if you don't have respect, you're not going to have influence in this life. And God created you and me to have an impact for good in this world. But if you're not even paying your own way, others rightly will not respect you enough to be influenced by you. They may not say it, but their thought is, if you're not able to even pay your own way, why should I listen to you? What could I possibly learn from you? Now, some people, of course, can't earn what they need. They're disabled. And in that case, it is appropriate to respectfully take care of them. But for most people, the requirement, kind of the entry-level requirement for impact in this world, is not being dependent on anybody else. Being responsible. Now, these two verses are summarized by the title of this series, Taking Responsibility. Let me show you a graph of how responsibility goes over the course of our life. We all start completely dependent when we're born. And then we go through this steep learning curve in childhood until we get into adulthood, where we are supposed to be responsible. We're supposed to be able to take care of ourselves, not be dependent like we were when we were babies or even children. And then most of us will end probably kind of the way we started. We don't like to think about that, especially those of us entering into the backside of this bell curve, is we will lose some of that independence. And the heavy lifting of responsibility will be diminished as we age. So we must learn how to be independent first, and then we must learn another hard lesson of how to appropriately give up more and more of our independence as we age. Now, it's these transition moments, the ramping up and the ramping down, that are filled with all kinds of challenges. And so today I want to talk about the first part, the challenge of raising dependent children to become independent adults, and how to do that, what that responsibility looks like. And then next Sunday, I'm going to talk about the challenge of losing that hard-earned dependence as we age, and how to navigate that in a way that has influence and dignity. Now, the road to responsibility, the one we're looking at this Sunday, can be described by three words that all begin with the letter L. First is the responsibility link, the things that are linked to responsibility, then the lie, and then finally the lessons. So let's begin with the links, the responsibility links. There's two of them, privilege and accountability. These are the two things that are linked to responsibility. Now, I know what a lot of you do, but I don't know what everyone in this room does for work. But I know that these three words, responsibility, privilege, and accountability, fit in and describe very clearly what you do, no matter what it is. The first word is responsibility. Your work has an area of responsibility. It comes from two Latin words that we translate in English, respond and able. You're able to respond. And the reason you're able to respond is because you have been given responsibility. You've been given ownership. It carries with it the idea of ownership, of borders, of what you're responsible for and what someone else is not responsible for. Years ago, my neighbor decided, I walked outside and I saw him putting up chicken wire all over the walls of his house. So I asked him what he was doing, and he said this was like a two-story house all the way to the top, around the front and the side of his house. And he said he wanted to have all the vines that he had grown on the bottom of his house climb this chicken wire and completely cover his house. And the reason he wanted to do this, well, is to save on paint, but also he thought it would save on energy. And I thought, that's a terrible idea. I mean, first of all, it's going to look horrible. I mean, it's going to look like a hobbit hole or something. It's just going to look awful. But did I say that? No. Why? It's not my property, not my walls. The borders of my property don't extend into the chicken wire on his wall. So it's his responsibility. He gets to do he's able to do what he wants to do on his property, with some limits. If the rat population grew because of this vine and came onto my property, now I have a responsibility. Now I'm able to respond. Now it entered into my area of responsibility. So here's a great definition of responsibility. It is the borders that define what you're in charge of. Here's the thing is we'd like to be in charge of everybody else, but we're not. We're in charge of us. We have opinions about everybody else. Doesn't matter. We're in charge of us. Your life, like my house and your house, has borders. There are things that you can do and things that you can't do. Now, linked to responsibility is accountability. That also has two Latin words. Able, again, connected to give an account. The definition of accountability literally is to answer for it, to answer for what you're responsible for. So if something goes wrong in your area of responsibility, you will be the one to answer for it. If rats came from my neighbor's house, he was going to have to answer for it. He would have to give an account for that, probably pay for the removal of the rats. If there is no accountability, then there's really no responsibility. Let's just say you're working for a company and you're in charge of sales in a particular region, but no one ever asks you to give a report on the sales in that region or to give an account of any kind for the sales in the region you're responsible for. What would happen? Over time, you would conclude that it really doesn't matter what you do. That you're not really actually responsible because there's no follow-up. There's no one asking you to answer for anything in that area. The last link to responsibility is privilege. Again, two Latin words. Privi is Latin for private. Leg, that's not how you pronounce it in Latin, but that's the segment of that word is Latin for law. So private law. What does that mean? A privilege is a personal advantage that is right. It is right. So let me explain how this works. Back to your sales position. If you're responsible for sales in that region and the sales go up, the sales increase in the region of your responsibility, what happens? Well, in every sales arrangement I've ever been a part of, your income goes up, right? The privilege goes up. You get a raise. Should everybody in your neighborhood then get a raise? They'd like a raise, but should they get a raise? No. Why? Why not? Because, and this is something our culture has gotten really confused on, the privilege is private. That's what the word privilege means. Private law. It belongs to you by right, not because you're just amazing, but because the responsibility belonged to yours. You own the responsibility, and therefore, when you advance in that responsibility, the privilege goes up with that. That's right. Now, God is the one who has linked all three of these together. We'll put them on the bottom of the screen. They're all, the arrows represent that they belong together. And when they line up like they are right here, the word that we use for that is just. That's just. That is right. So let me explain it this way. Let's say you're given a promotion at your job. So your responsibility was here. Now let's say it moved up. Okay, your responsibility has increased. What happens if your privilege stays right where it is? If there's no raise that goes with that responsibility? What would you feel? You'd feel taken advantage of, right? And you'd be right. Well, what if 3 months after your promotion, your boss comes to you and holds you accountable for and accuses you of poor performance in an area that is no longer your responsibility? how would you feel? You'd be upset, right? You'd be mad, and rightly so. Because it's not right for you to be held accountable for something that's not your responsibility. And it's not right for you to be asked to be responsible for something that there is no privilege attached to it. And so whenever these are not lined up, we feel it. It's wrong. It's unjust. Now, no one has to tell you this. No one has to explain this diagram to you. We just feel it. You're given a greater responsibility, and your boss says, oh, and there's no more money that comes with this. And you're like, well, that's not right. No one had to tell you this. You just felt that. These are linked, and they should rise and fall together. Now, one of these three is designed by God to power the movement of all of them. And that is the word responsibility, the central theme of this three-part message series. So growing in responsibility is like this ladder. It's like climbing a ladder. You grow one rung at a time. And as you climb the ladder of responsibility, what happens is the other two, both privilege and accountability, rise commensurate with it. They go together because they're linked. They're not just separate, independent ideas. They're linked in the way God has created reality. Jesus described the responsibility ladder this way in Luke 16, verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. What is he saying? How do you know if you can trust someone with a big responsibility? Do you just look for someone that just appears amazing? No, you look for the track record. You know, this is why we do interviews. This is why there's resumes. What is the track record? You don't just hire someone for a big responsibility and they have no history in that area. You need to see the track record of how they handled the small thing, and then the next larger thing, and then the next larger thing. And if they've been faithful, if they've been trustworthy with smaller things, then they get the next thing, then the next thing, and then eventually they can be trusted with a lot of responsibility. This is the way God has designed reality to work. When I graduated from college, it took me 3 months to find a job. I graduated in the early 80s. Big recession was going on. I could not find work in the area of my degree. And so after 3 months, I was getting desperate, and eventually I was able to find a job learning how to run a printing press. That was not what my college degree was in. I don't think they have college degree. Well, maybe they do, but that's not what I got my degree in. But it's all I could find. And I earned just a little bit more than minimum wage. And that was my responsibility, to learn how to run a printing press. And I was accountable, not for a lot, but for everything that came that was printed out of that press. That was my responsibility. And I got a little more than minimum wage. That was a privilege that came with that responsibility and that accountability. And I learned how to run that printing press, and I got better and better and better at that job. And eventually, I got a promotion. It wasn't a big promotion, but I was put at the front counter to work with the customers that came into the shop. And I got better and better at that job. Again, it wasn't really hard, but I learned it. And then eventually, the owner asked me to manage the shop for him. So I did that for a while. With each one of these rungs, my pay, my privilege increased, and my accountability, the questions that were asked about what I did and the area of what I did, that the number of those questions went up. My accountability went up with it. 8 years and many, many rungs later, I was put in charge of a medium-sized advertising agency with 25 employees. That's the job I wanted when I got out of college. I would have preferred to start there. But that is not how it works. You just got to find a ladder If it's in your area of passion, great. If not, any ladder will do. And start climbing. That's the way God grows us, as we take responsibility. But then that brings us to the second one, that's the responsibility lie. The responsibility lie says that there's a privilege ladder. The lie basically is this: the ladder isn't under responsibility, it's under privilege. Life should just get more and more amazing regardless of what I do, and I should get more and more stuff regardless of what I do. That's the lie. And you may think that's a new lie. That is the oldest lie literally in the book. I mean, we know why this lie is appealing. Because let me ask you this: which of these three words, responsibility, accountability, and privilege, is most appealing to you? Privilege. That's the fun one. And this fact is what led to the very first sin. Like I said, the oldest lie in the book. Adam and Eve were given clear responsibilities. Borders. Tend to the Garden of Eden. It had borders. And with that responsibility came the privilege of they could eat anything that they wanted that grew in that garden, with one exception. One tree, just one tree. But it turns out the privilege of eating the fruit off of that tree is what they got fixated on. So they ignored their responsibility and they took the privilege from that forbidden tree. They ate that fruit. And in doing so, they rebelled against God. The word in the Bible that describes moving the ladder under privilege is called rebellion. That's what rebellion does. It moves the ladder from responsibility over to privilege. And in doing so, it tries to decouple, to unlink privilege from responsibility. Now, that very first sin put every single human problem and sin to follow in motion. Now what we do is we demand privilege. This is true of all of us. We want as much privilege as possible with as little responsibility as possible. And this shows up in all kinds of places. Let me just give you 3 examples. This is what drives, people getting into too much debt. Basically we want the privilege of having something now. We don't want to wait for it. We don't want to earn for it. We don't want to save up for years for it if it's a bigger purchase. So we go into debt. And not all debt is wrong, but debt driven by just simply wanting to climb the privilege ladder is how we get in trouble. So we live at a higher rung than we're responsible for. This is another example. This is why we struggle with sexual immorality. Now, I know our culture doesn't think there's such a thing, but God put the privilege of sex behind the borders of marriage. Just like he put the forbidden fruit on that one tree and said, here's a border. Don't cross it. What God says is you take on the responsibility of marriage first, and then you can have the privilege of sex. But we don't want to wait to make that kind of commitment until we can afford that kind of commitment. We don't want to wait and be legally accountable for the entire relationship. We just want sex. So we take that privilege separate from the responsibility. Another example. This is what drives crime. Theft basically is taking what someone else earned. Every sin follows this pattern. Every problem that we encounter in this world is the result of this injustice, decoupling. Now, when we move the ladder of responsibility into privilege, we violate the foundation of the way God made reality. It's kind of akin to defying gravity. It goes against moral gravity. We defy justice. And whenever we do that, we put in motion the wheels of God's judgment. judgment begins to come as we climb the ladder of privilege. So, in one of the examples, the guy walks into a bank, takes the privilege of money other people have earned, and judgment begins. He is arrested, he's tried, and a judge sentences him to prison. He is eventually held accountable for his actions. That's what judgment is you are eventually held accountable. The momentary privilege is taken away, and he suffers loss. He goes down the accountability experience. Now, before the loss, before he stole the money, he was free to walk around. Now, his area of responsibility is super, super small. A cell. This is not just because of the justice system, this is because of God's justice. Romans 14:12 says, "So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God." We will be held accountable. So even if it's not against our laws, if it violates God's, there will be judgment and there will be loss. Now, it's rarely an instant experience, this judgment, this loss. But eventually, this arc, if we climb the privilege ladder, eventually the arc of judgment and loss will show up and we will be held accountable. This diagram is the way the world works. And so when it comes to the responsibility that we have as parents, we are needing to raise our kids to understand. They don't need to know this chart, but they need to understand that this is the world that they are growing up in. They need to learn this by experience. Well, how do you do that? I mean, you don't want to take a 2-year-old and just put them in the real world and expect them to survive. That's impossible. That's cruel. They can't do that. They're not ready to take on the full responsibilities of adulthood. That's at the top of the responsibility ladder. But at the age of 2, they are ready to take on the responsibility of many things. Let's say the responsibility of picking up their toys before dinner. Well, what if they refuse to pick up their toys before dinner? And I promise you they will. Well, then you have a gold mine of an opportunity. They are refusing to take responsibility for something that they are able to do. So they need to experience a reduction in privilege. And if they don't experience a reduction in privilege, if you just walk in and say, never mind, and you do it yourself, or you just yell at them with your words, they're going to learn to think that the world is tilted like this. And it's not. It's like this. I don't know what the privilege is that you should take away. You're the parent. God gives parents unique insight into what would really help get through to their kids. You know, for us, it was like, all right, no dinner until you clean up your toys. That's cruel. No, I mean, we didn't starve him. But God has designed hunger to do amazing things for motivation. So they learn, oh, these things go together. So after the toy cleanup rung on the responsibility ladder, maybe the next rung is help with cleaning up the dishes. And then maybe help making the meal. Again, you don't want a 2-year-old at the stove, but I don't know, 5, 6, that'd be fine. And then maybe they can eventually make the meal. I know it's not going to taste as good as the one you make, but that's how they learn. And then maybe shopping, helping shop for the food, and then maybe earning some of the money to pay for some of what they need. What I'm saying is if children don't learn to climb the responsibility ladder at home, it is very hard and extremely painful to learn that in the real world. God has designed family life to be a very kind and loving experience of the real world before they get into the real world, because the real world doesn't love them as much as mom and dad does. Before the early 1900s, this transition, from childhood to adulthood was seen in just those two phases. It was just you were a child, and then you became an adult. If you read back in history, it's amazing to see what some of the amazing people of history did at a pretty young age. The first admiral of the U.S. Navy, you know how old he was when he was a midshipman on a naval vessel? Midshipman is the lowest officer on a vessel. You know how old he was? He was 9 in the 1800s. Now, that's illegal now, but he had climbed some responsibility to get to that point. So this is the way it used to be. You were a child, and then you were an adult. The transition from one to the other was marked by clear, common rites of passage. But then in 1904, G. Stanley Hall published his influential work titled Adolescence. Here's a picture of the first copies of this. This book marked the formal beginning of adolescent psychology as a field of study. Now, the word wasn't new, but the study of it was brand new, marked by this book. Now, before this book, it wasn't instant, but over the decades, before this book, the concept of adolescence was not widely recognized. Young people were generally considered to be adults once they reached puberty. Historically, this was the way it was. What Hall's work did is it added a transition phase between childhood and adulthood called adolescence. And here's what happened is the more adolescence was studied, the more mysterious it got. The clear rites of passage disappeared over time, and in its place was just this set of self-exploration questions to wrestle with, like, who am I, and what do I really want out of life? And those are hard, navel-gazing questions to answer. I'm not saying they're not good questions. They're hard to get a lot of traction with. So the more mysterious adolescence got, the longer it got. And this is the way it looks right now. You're a child, and then you enter into the hinterland of adolescence. And who knows when and if you'll ever emerge. So what I want to say is, actually, you've probably heard this. There's a new term now. You know what the next term is? Adultolescence, right? You've heard that. Adultolescence. That's when you're an adult and you're still not able to pay your own way. Now, I'm not saying this to make fun of people. I'm just saying this is where we are as a culture right now. This is the challenge that you as parents face. And it is the ladder of responsibility that is the only way to climb through the meandering path and the fog of adolescence and become an adult. So it is your responsibility as a parent to help and insist that your child climb the ladder rather than enter into the fog and the mysterious pursuit from which they might never exit. That brings us to the responsibility lessons, the last one. There are many lessons that need to be learned to be responsible. I want to focus on 2. First one is keeping your word. Doing what we say we will do is one of the key lessons in being responsible. James 3:3-5 says something very interesting about our words. It says, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. What is this saying? It's saying, you look at the size of a rudder on a ship, and it's pretty small, but it directs the whole ship. You look at the bit in the mouth of a horse, and it's pretty small, but it turns the head of the horse and the body of that heavy horse. And that's what our words are like, our tongue is like. It's a very small part of the body, but it has the power to direct the whole body. Why? Well, unlike the rest of the animal kingdom, our body is directed more by thought than by instinct. This is what's unique about us from the rest of the animal kingdom in this area. We do have instinct, but we don't have to be governed by our instinct, by our impulses, by our emotions. We have the power, because we're made in the image of God, to direct ourselves. We are created to speak and then act, not just feel and then act. So our first area of responsibility is to learn how to control our own bodies. You know, we're born having little to no control over our bodies. I mean, we need diapers to contain our bodily functions when we're born. But over time, we learn to talk, and we learn to listen, and then we learn how to use our words to control and direct our bodies. There's really two stages of verbal self-control that are so important for children to learn. Stage one is use your words, not your emotions, to communicate what you want. This is so important. When a child is young, they need to grow up from the screaming stage to the talking stage. I mean, when they're born, they just scream, and that's fine. They're hungry, they're cold, they're miserable in some way, and it's up for you to begin the mystery of trying to figure out what's going on. But once your children can talk, they need to describe what they need, not just scream about and cry about what they need. This was very important for us. Once our children could talk, we stopped responding to their emotional screaming and crying. And what I mean by that is they would start screaming, they would start crying, they would start fussing, and we would get in their face, not angrily, but kindly, and say, you need to use your words. Use your words, not your emotions, to tell me what you want. We said that so many times. Use your words, not your emotions, to tell me what you want. Even if we knew what they wanted, we would not respond to their emotions. That's stage one. Stage two then is use your words, not your emotions, to determine what you will do. They first have to learn how to describe what's going on inside here. What am I feeling? And put words to it. That's stage one. Stage two is then those words direct what they do. In this stage, the child needs to go beyond using words to honoring their words. If a child says that they will do something and they don't, and nothing happens, they will learn that their words don't really matter. And that's not true. That's not what God thinks of their words. So we need to teach our kids how to make good commitments and how to keep them. And like every other thing on the responsibility ladder, you start small. And if they bail on their commitments, don't bail them out. Help them feel the consequences of that appropriately. So keeping your word, lesson number 2 is paying your way. Our kids are like us. They want privilege without responsibility. When we allow them to experience only the privileges of life, we are preparing them for a world that doesn't exist. If they grow up just having things handed to them without any responsibility attached to them, they're going to be terrible employees. And they will discover that their bosses don't care how cute they are. If they don't work hard, they're not going to get the privilege of getting paid. We often told our kids, you know what? If you just show up on time and do what your boss tells you to do, you're going to be in the top % of the workforce. That's how you learn to pay your own way. Now, this is a challenge for parents because we love our kids and we want them to be happy. So it's very easy for us to dish out privileges that make them happy. No child ever responded to, hey, clean up your room with, yay! And we don't like children who, we want children, yay! And so the price for that is, well, here's something fun. Here's a privilege. So it's easy for us to dish out the privileges that make them happy and ignore the responsibilities that will help them grow up and truly be happy. It's one of the prices of parenting. You got to be emotionally tough to be a parent. If you're an emotional wimp, it's a tough assignment. Paying your way is best learned incrementally, like everything else, every other thing on the responsibility ladder, one rung at a time. So one of the questions that's really helpful if you've got kids at home is to ask, what new responsibilities can you add to them? That takes a lot of thought, a lot of effort, but it's important. For us, one example is, I think when they were around 10 or so, we took their clothing budget off of our budget and gave them all of that money and said, this is your clothing budget for the entire year. And we helped them. We didn't just say, here's cash. We said, here's how much, and we helped them when we coached them. But when you give a child their entire clothing budget for the year in August, it's like Christmas in August. And no matter how you coach them, they're going to make some mistakes. So let's just say, for example, they decide to buy the most expensive designer jeans and they don't last through the whole year. Bummer. Right? You don't bail them out. I mean, thankfully it happened right around the time when holes in your jeans became popular, but they've got to experience these things. Because if they don't learn how to be accountable for their clothing decisions, then they won't learn how to be accountable and responsible for their car decisions or their housing decisions or their career decisions or their marriage decisions. Like Jesus said, if you're not faithful with a little, you won't be faithful with a bunch. 2 quick notes as we wrap up on this. Kids are usually ready for more responsibility than you think they are. This was my experience growing up in general. My kids understood way more than I thought they understood. They were way smarter than I thought they were. They were able to do way more than I thought they were. And the reason I was always, my wife and I would say we were generally behind the curve on giving them more responsibility is because it takes thought to give them responsibility. And it's just easier to do it yourself. If you're trying to teach your kids how to cook a meal, never mind. Let me just do it. I'm hungry. You just got to pay the price. The other thing I would say is it's easier to think of new privileges than new responsibilities. So just expect that. Ideas will pop in your mind about how to make your kids happy, not how to make them responsible. So go with that. If you want to give them a new privilege, then pause and think, all right, I would like to give them this, or I would like for them to experience this. We want to go to Disneyland, whatever. I don't know. I'm just making stuff up here now. Okay, so then what new responsibility can you attach to that? Again, you're the parent. It's amazing to me how much insight God gives parents if they put in the effort. So, 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 through 12. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. That takes a lot of ambition. Next week, the challenge of losing all of that hard-earned independence as we grow older. Let's pray. Father, again, we thank you for your word that, as you said, describes what is real. And we are only given 2 options. We can rebel against it and stumble and bump our heads against all kinds of painful things in life, or we can walk in your ways and experience less pain. So we just pray that you would give us insight into what to do. I pray specifically for the parents in this room. You would help them to understand where their kids are, what they're capable of, and you would give them just a flood of insight this week about how they might help their kids grow in responsibility. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.